Officer, I can assure you, this car is not stolen. My registration is on the display inside.
Sir, I have a report. Step away from the vehicle. Now.
The hum was almost imperceptible, a low thrum of latent power that was more felt than heard. It was the sound of progress, the sound of 1,000 meticulous calculations happening every second. Marcus Thorne loved that sound. At 42, he'd built an empire on just that, the quiet, efficient, and relentless application of logic. His company, Nexus Data, had revolutionized predictive analytics for supply chains, and the gleaming obsidian pearl Tesla Model S he was driving was a small, tangible reward for a decade of 16-hour days. It was a Tuesday morning, the California sun already warming the pristine, tree-lined streets of Atherton. He was on his way back from a 7 a.m. meeting with a venture capital firm on Sand Hill Road, and the car's battery indicator suggested a brief stop. He pulled into a Shell station that looked more like a boutique resort than a place to refuel. Manicured flower beds, pristine pumps, and not a single spot of oil staining the concrete. He navigated the Tesla toward the charging station tucked away in the corner. A sleek, modern monolith that stood apart from the traditional gas pumps. The car glided to a stop with a gentle sigh of its air suspension. As he stepped out, the sharp cut of his Tom Ford suit felt a little formal for the setting, but it was his daily armor. He was a CEO. He was also a 6'3" black man in one of the wealthiest and whitest enclaves in the United States. He was used to the occasional second glance, the momentary flicker of surprise in people's eyes. It was a tax he'd paid his whole life. He unplugged the charging nozzle from the station and was about to connect it to his car when the sound sliced through the morning calm. It wasn't the quiet hum of technology. It was the sharp, aggressive wail of a police siren, growing louder with alarming speed. Marcus paused, nozzle in hand, and looked down the street. A police cruiser, a Ford Explorer, was hurtling toward the gas station. It didn't slow down. Instead, it swerved aggressively into the entrance, its tires chirping in protest and angled to block the Tesla. For a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of detached curiosity. There must be an emergency, a robbery, maybe? He stood still, a cooperative witness ready to provide a statement. The cruiser's door swung open and a police officer emerged. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a military-style haircut and a jaw that looked permanently clenched. His hand was already resting on the butt of his sidearm. His eyes, shielded by mirrored aviator sunglasses, were locked directly on Marcus. "Step away from the vehicle!" The officer's voice boomed, a command that reverberated across the otherwise peaceful station. The tone was not one of inquiry. It was an accusation. Marcus's mind, trained to process data and identify anomalies, struggled to compute. He was the only person near the car. The command was for him. He slowly placed the charging nozzle back in its holster. He raised his hands slightly, palms open, a universal sign of non-aggression he'd learned long ago he might need. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. He'd learned that his deep baritone could be perceived as threatening, so he intentionally softened it, rounding the edges of his words. "I said, step away from the vehicle. Now. Hands where I can see them." The officer began to advance, his movements stiff and deliberate. His name tag read Decker. His gaze flickered from Marcus's face to the Tesla, then back again. In that flick, Marcus saw it, the anomaly, the miscalculation. The officer wasn't responding to a robbery. He was responding to him. "This is my car, officer," Marcus stated, not moving. It wasn't defiance, but an attempt to inject a crucial piece of data into a flawed equation. "I was just about to charge it." Decker stopped about 10 feet away, his stance widening. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description, a black Tesla Model S. High-end model. Reported stolen from a residence in Palo Alto less than an hour ago." The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture Marcus had seen countless times before, just never with himself in the frame. A black man, an expensive car, an affluent neighborhood. The algorithm was simple, brutally efficient, and deeply, fundamentally wrong. The accusation was so ludicrous it was almost insulting. He had personally configured this car on Tesla's website, waited 3 months for it to be built, and paid for it with a wire transfer that would have made his younger self faint. "Officer, I can assure you, this car is not stolen," Marcus said, maintaining his calm. "My registration and insurance are on the main display inside. The car is registered to me, Marcus Thorne. My driver's license is in my wallet." He made a slight, slow motion toward his jacket pocket. "Hold it!" Decker barked, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Don't move. Don't reach for anything." The air crackled with tension. The morning sun glinted off the polished steel of Decker's badge, the mirrored surface of his sunglasses, and the obsidian paint of the car that was now the centerpiece of a crime scene where no crime had been committed. The quiet hum of the charging station was drowned out by the heavy thrum of Marcus's own heart. He was a man who solved complex problems for a living, who built systems that ran on pure logic. But he was now caught in a system that operated on a different code entirely, a code written with the ink of prejudice. And it was a system that was crashing down on him right here, in the bright, unforgiving light of a Tuesday morning. Logic. That was Marcus's sanctuary. In the face of chaos, you find the variables, you identify the core function, and you execute a solution. The variable here was Officer Decker's assumption. The core function was proving ownership. The solution should have been simple. "Officer Decker," Marcus began again, his voice a steady, low-frequency wave in the tense air. "I understand your position. You have a report and you're doing your job. However, I can resolve this for you in about 10 seconds without needing to reach for my wallet." Decker didn't respond. His silence was a wall. His focus remained absolute, his body a coiled spring of suspicion. "My phone is my key," Marcus explained slowly, as if talking a nervous computer through a reboot. "The car is linked to my Tesla account, which is linked to my identity. I can unlock it, lock it, and even show you the digital title right here on the screen. It's all cryptographically secured." He held up his left hand, showing the iPhone clutched in it. "No physical key is required. If you'd allow me, I can demonstrate." He hoped the language of technology might bridge the gap, that words like cryptographically secured might signal a level of sophistication that ran counter to the crude stereotype of a car thief. He was offering a clean, irrefutable data point. Decker's lip curled in a slight sneer. "You think I'm stupid? You're going to play with your phone while I'm conducting an investigation?" To Decker, the phone wasn't a key or a source of data, it was a distraction, a trick. He was a man of steel and procedure, and this talk of digital keys and accounts was just noise. Interference in a signal he thought was perfectly clear. "It's not a trick. Officer, it's how the technology works," Marcus pressed, trying to keep the frustration from seeping into his voice. "The car's VIN is registered to my name. You can run the plates. They will come back to me. The address will be my home in Los Altos Hills. You can verify all of this through your own system without this escalation." He was offering Decker an out, a way to de-escalate without losing face. He was appealing to the procedural part of the officer's brain, the part that should have valued verification over confrontation. But Decker wasn't listening. He was watching. He was watching Marcus's expensive suit, his confident posture, his calm articulation, and seeing not a successful CEO, but a suspect who was too clever, too composed. In Decker's world, innocence was supposed to look scared and flustered. Marcus's composure was perversely being read as guilt. "Sir, I am giving you a lawful order. Step away from the vehicle and place your hands on the hood of my patrol car." Decker's voice was flat, devoid of any room for negotiation. He had made his decision. The investigation would proceed down a single track, and Marcus's explanations were mere obstacles to be cleared. Marcus felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his stomach. It was the anger of impotence, of having the truth, the facts, the data, and none of it mattering. He had built his life on the principle that the right information leads to the right outcome. Here, information was irrelevant. The outcome had been decided the moment he'd been profiled. He thought about the irony. In his world, a person's identity was a complex, multifaceted collection of verifiable data points, a rich tapestry of digital and real-world interactions. To Officer Decker, his identity was a single, grainy pixel of information. Black man, expensive car, the rest was just noise. He looked past Decker, at the polished chrome of the gas pumps, at a woman in yoga pants cautiously watching from her minivan, at the perfectly blue, cloudless sky. It was a beautiful day, a perfect day to have your entire identity, your accomplishments, your very reality, denied. He had the key in his hand, a digital key that represented the pinnacle of modern technology, but he was being judged by a prejudice as old as the country itself. "I'm not going to argue with you, officer," Marcus said, his voice now tinged with a weary resignation. "But I want it noted that I am complying under protest. You are refusing to verify my ownership of this vehicle, which I have offered to do for you." He made a slow, deliberate turn, his expensive leather shoes scuffing on the clean concrete, and began to walk toward the patrol car. Each step was a concession, a small defeat. He was a man who could command a boardroom of 100 people with a few quiet words, who could see market trends months before his competitors. Yet, in this moment, his power, his intellect, and his success were meaningless. He was walking away from his own car, treated as a criminal, because an officer with a badge and a story in his head refused to see the truth right in front of him. The world of analog prejudice had just slammed the door on his digital key, and as he moved toward the waiting glare of the patrol car's hood, he heard the sound of more sirens approaching. The escalation wasn't over. It was just getting started. The second siren was higher pitched, a frantic descant to the first car's baritone wail. A second cruiser, identical to Decker's, screeched into the gas station, taking an aggressive flanking position on the other side of the Tesla. It was followed almost immediately by a third, which blocked the main exit, effectively sealing the entire scene. The quiet, boutique gas station had been transformed into a tactical zone. 3 police vehicles for one man charging his car. The absurdity was staggering. Doors opened. 2 more officers emerged, younger than Decker but wearing the same hardened expression. They moved with a practiced, fluid motion, one taking a position near the back of the Tesla, the other staying near his vehicle, his hand resting near his taser. They looked to Decker, the senior officer on scene, for cues. Decker's posture straightened, his authority now magnified by the presence of his colleagues. He was no longer a lone officer making a stop. He was the commander of a scene. This show of force was a new variable. It changed the math. What was a one-on-one misunderstanding had now become a full-blown police action, and with it, the audience grew. The woman in the minivan was no longer pretending to check her phone. She was watching, wide-eyed. The gas station attendant had come out of his booth, peering nervously over a rack of potato chips. And then Marcus saw him, a young man, probably a college student, standing near the air pump. He had his phone out, held not casually, but horizontally, with both hands. He was recording. The presence of that phone, that single, silent electronic witness, changed the atmosphere more than the arrival of the two other cruisers combined. Every action, every word was now being captured, time-stamped, and prepared for a different kind of court, the court of public opinion. Marcus knew this. He also knew Decker knew this. He saw the subtle shift in Decker's stance, the way his jaw tightened even further. The camera wasn't a deterrent. It was a challenge. It was an affront to his authority in his arena. He was being watched, judged, and he reacted not with caution, but with a surge of defensive aggression. The need to control the narrative, to be seen as unequivocally in charge, became paramount. "I told you to put your hands on my car!" Decker yelled, his voice now amplified for the benefit of his colleagues and the recording phone. He gestured sharply with his chin. "On the hood! Now!" Marcus complied, walking the final few feet and placing his palms flat on the hot metal of the cruiser's hood. The sun had warmed it to an uncomfortable temperature. He stared at his own distorted reflection in the dark blue paint. He saw the face of a man who was supposed to be a pillar of the community, a job creator, a symbol of success, now being treated like a common criminal. Decker approached from behind. Marcus could hear the crunch of his boots, the rustle of his uniform. "You want to be difficult? You want to argue with me in front of everyone? Is that it?" Decker's voice was low, meant only for Marcus, but filled with a simmering rage. He was angry that Marcus hadn't folded immediately, that he hadn't been intimidated, that he dared to use logic against a badge. "I was trying to explain the situation to you, officer," Marcus said, his voice muffled by his position. "You were obstructing," Decker hissed back. "I have probable cause for a stop, and you're arguing. That's obstruction." He was already building his report in his head, stacking the charges, justifying the overwhelming show of force. The stolen car report was the foundation, but Marcus's calm refusal to be railroaded was being twisted into a new crime. One of the newly arrived officers, a young man with the name Garrity on his tag, walked over to the Tesla. He peered through the tinted windows, his hand shielding his eyes from the glare. "See anything, Garrity?" Decker called out, his voice now back to a performative, authoritative volume. "Can't see much. Windows are dark, looks clean, though no visible damage to the ignition or door locks," Garrity reported back. It was a small data point in Marcus's favor, but one Decker seemed to ignore completely. The young man with the camera took a few steps closer, trying to get a better angle. His movement caught Decker's eye. Decker shot him a venomous glare. "This is an active police investigation. You need to back up. Back up now." The student flinched, but only took one step back, his phone remaining steady. He knew his rights. He was in a public place, and he was a safe distance away. His quiet defiance seemed to infuriate Decker even more. It was another challenge to his absolute control. Decker turned his frustration back on the one person he could control, Marcus. He grabbed Marcus's left arm, twisting it behind his back with a practiced, painful efficiency. The motion was unnecessarily rough, designed to inflict discomfort and assert dominance. Marcus grunted involuntarily as his shoulder joint was strained. "You wanted to make a scene," Decker said, his voice a low growl in Marcus's ear as he wrenched his other arm back. "Congratulations, you've got one." The scene was now set. The audience was in place. The cameras were rolling, and Officer Decker, backed into a corner by his own flawed assumptions and the unwelcome lens of public scrutiny, chose to escalate. He reached for his handcuffs. The quiet morning, the hum of technology, the promise of a productive day, It had all evaporated, replaced by the raw, undeniable reality of cold steel and the crushing weight of authority misapplied. He was no longer just a subject of suspicion. He was about to become a prisoner. There is a unique sound that handcuffs make. It's not a loud clang, but a series of small, sharp clicks. A dry, metallic sound that speaks of finality. Ratchet, click, click. It's the sound of freedom being revoked, of a person being transformed into a suspect, a prisoner. For Marcus Thorne, that sound was deafening. It echoed in the sun-drenched gas station, a jarring punctuation mark at the end of a sentence he never should have been in. Decker cinched the first cuff around Marcus's right wrist, pulling it brutally tight. The serrated edge of the steel bit into his skin. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the profound sense of humiliation. His suit jacket was bunched up around his shoulders, his silk tie askew. Just an hour ago, he had been confidently sketching out a multi-million-dollar logistics strategy on a whiteboard. Now, he was being physically restrained, his hands bound behind his back like an animal. "What am I being arrested for?" Marcus asked. His voice strained. He forced himself to keep it steady, to not give Decker the satisfaction of hearing him break. "For now, obstruction of justice and resisting an officer," Decker replied, his voice matter-of-fact as he secured the second cuff. "We'll sort out the grand theft auto charge at the station." The accusation was a fiction, a grotesque distortion of reality. He hadn't resisted. He had attempted to cooperate with facts. He hadn't obstructed. He had tried to provide clarity. But Decker's narrative was now the official one, soon to be immortalized in an incident report. The young man with the phone camera was still filming, his lens an unblinking eye. Marcus made a conscious effort to turn his head slightly, to ensure his face was visible. If this was going to be his reality, he wanted it documented without ambiguity. He wanted the world to see not a cowering criminal, but a man of stature being brought low by a system that refused to see him for who he was. Officer Garrity and the third officer, whose name tag Marcus couldn't see, stood by, their expressions unreadable. They were cogs in the machine, following the lead of the senior officer. Marcus wondered if they saw the injustice, if they felt even a flicker of doubt, or was the blue wall of silence already descending, a silent pact to validate their colleagues' actions, no matter how questionable? Garrity had reported no signs of a break-in, a fact that should have prompted caution, a reassessment, but it had been discarded like irrelevant noise. "I want you to know. Officer Decker," Marcus said, speaking clearly and deliberately for the benefit of the recording, "that you are arresting me for a crime I did not commit. You have refused to verify my identity and my ownership of this vehicle. This arrest is unlawful." Decker responded by grabbing Marcus by the bicep, his fingers digging in and hauling him upright from his bent-over position against the cruiser. "You can tell it to the judge," he sneered, shoving Marcus toward the open rear door of his patrol car. "Get in." The back of a police car is a world unto itself. It's molded plastic, hard and unforgiving. There are no handles on the inside, no way to escape. The window is a thick sheet of plexiglass, separating the arrested from the arrestor. As Marcus awkwardly maneuvered himself onto the seat, his cuffed hands making the movement clumsy and difficult, the door slammed shut with a heavy, final thud. The sound sealed him in. Through the window, the world looked distorted, unreal. He saw the young man with the phone finally lower it, his face a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction. He had his story. He saw the other officers beginning to cordon off the Tesla with yellow police tape, turning his personal property into a piece of evidence against him. The absurdity was a physical weight. They were processing his car as a stolen vehicle, while the rightful owner sat in a cage not 20 feet away. Decker stood outside for a moment, talking to Garrity. His body language was self-assured, triumphant. He had faced a challenge to his authority and had decisively won. He had restored order. But what he saw as order, Marcus saw as chaos, a complete breakdown of reason and justice. The air in the back of the car was hot and stale. The sun beat down on the roof. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the police radio, a stream of codes and jargon that felt like a foreign language. Marcus leaned his head back against the hard plastic seat and closed his eyes. The cold click of the handcuffs still echoed in his ears. It was the sound of a system designed to protect, but which had, in his case, done the complete opposite. It had targeted, accused, and condemned him based on a snapshot, a stereotype. He had spent his life building a reputation, an identity of success and integrity, and in the space of 10 minutes, it had all been stripped away, replaced by the cold, unyielding reality of a pair of steel handcuffs. The injustice wasn't just in the arrest, it was in the chilling ease with which it had all happened. The drive to the Northwood Police Precinct was short. A 12-minute journey through manicured suburban streets that felt like a surreal parade. People on the sidewalks, joggers, mothers with strollers, would glance at the patrol car and look away, their faces betraying a fleeting curiosity. Marcus wondered what they saw. Did they see a criminal being taken off their safe streets? Or did they see a man in a tailored suit sitting in the back of a police car and sense the dissonance, the wrongness of the image? Officer Decker didn't speak a word. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally tapping at the computer mounted to his dashboard. He was likely already writing his report, codifying his version of events, turning his assumptions into official fact. The silence between them was thick with animosity. The precinct was a modern, low-slung building of beige brick and tinted glass, designed to look more like a community center than a fortress. But inside, the aesthetic of public service quickly gave way to the hard realities of law enforcement. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. The floors were scuffed linoleum, and the walls were painted a soul-crushing shade of institutional gray. Decker led Marcus through a set of double doors into the main bullpen. Desks were arranged in functional clusters. Phones rang intermittently. Officers looked up as they entered. The sight of a tall black man in a high-end suit, his hands cuffed behind his back, caused an immediate, if subtle, ripple through the room. Conversations paused for a beat. Eyes lingered. Marcus could feel their gazes on him, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and, from a few, something else. A flicker of weary recognition. He recognized that look. It was the look of people who knew a mess when they saw one. It was in the eyes of a gray-haired detective who briefly stopped typing and watched Decker with a look of profound skepticism. It was in the face of a female officer at the front desk who sighed quietly and shook her head as she turned back to her paperwork. They weren't looking at Marcus as a criminal. They were looking at Decker as a problem. The booking area was a small, sterile annex off the main room. Decker roughly guided Marcus toward a bench bolted to the wall. "Sit," he commanded. As Decker began the initial paperwork with the booking sergeant, a stout, older man named Miller, Marcus watched the scene unfold. His mind, now past the initial shock, had shifted into analytical mode. He was observing, gathering data. "What have we got, Decker?" Sergeant Miller asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't look up from his screen. "Grand theft auto, felony obstruction, resisting arrest," Decker announced, a little too loudly. It was a performance. Miller stopped typing. He slowly looked up, first at Decker, then at Marcus. He took in the suit, the expensive watch still on Marcus's cuffed wrist, the calm, intelligent look in his eyes. Miller's gaze then drifted to the paperwork in Decker's hand. He grunted, a sound of deep-seated doubt. "Grand theft auto? This gentleman?" Miller asked, his tone flat. "Driving a black Model S. Matched the description of one stolen out of Palo Alto this morning. Was uncooperative at the scene. Refused to provide identification," Decker recited, his voice defensive. "He refused, or he didn't have a chance to." Miller's question was pointed. He'd seen this movie before. He knew Decker. Decker had a reputation. Ambitious, aggressive, and with a complaint file that was noticeably thicker than average for an officer with only 5 years on the force. Before Decker could answer, a new figure entered the booking area. A woman in her late 40s, with a sharp, intelligent face and the silver lieutenant's bars on her collar. Her name tag read Sutton. She held a tablet in her hand, and her expression was one of controlled fury. "Decker, my office. Now," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. It wasn't a request. "Lieutenant, I'm in the middle of booking a suspect. You're in the middle of creating a Category 5 lawsuit for this city." Sutton cut him off, her eyes flashing. "The video from your stop is already on Twitter with 50,000 views. The mayor's office has called twice in the last 10 minutes. Get in my office." Decker's face went pale. The swagger, the absolute certainty, vanished, replaced by a look of dawning horror. He had been so focused on controlling the physical scene, he had completely underestimated the digital fallout. The silent witness with the smartphone had already delivered his verdict to the world. Sutton's gaze shifted to Marcus, who was still seated on the bench. Her expression softened slightly, a flicker of professionalism replacing the anger. "Sir, I am Lieutenant Sutton. I apologize for the situation you're in. We are going to sort this out immediately." She then looked at Sergeant Miller. "Get those cuffs off him. Get him some water, and hold all processing on this arrest. Is that clear?" "Crystal, Lieutenant," Miller said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. He reached for the handcuff key. As the steel cuffs were removed, Marcus rubbed his wrists, the deep red indentations a stark reminder of the last hour. He watched Decker follow Lieutenant Sutton toward her office, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The sterile walls of the precinct, which had moments ago felt like a cage, now felt like a stage. A drama was playing out, and the roles of protagonist and antagonist had suddenly, dramatically, been reversed. The system had made a catastrophic error, and now, in the harsh, fluorescent light of the station, it was beginning to reckon with the cost. While Marcus sat in the back of the patrol car, his world shrinking to the confines of molded plastic and plexiglass, a different reality was exploding into existence. It started with a single tweet from an account belonging to @KevinChen_Stanford. The tweet was simple. "Unbelievable. Atherton PD arresting a black man for charging his own Tesla. They have 3 cars here. I'm filming. Hashtag police reform, hashtag Tesla guy, hashtag driving while black." Attached was the video, 2 minutes and 47 seconds of raw, unedited footage. It began with Decker's aggressive commands and Marcus's calm. Logical attempts to de-escalate. It captured Marcus explaining the concept of a digital key, an explanation met with derision. It showed the arrival of the 2 other cruisers, the absurd tactical response to a non-existent threat, and it culminated in the most damning sequence, Decker, visibly angered by the camera, roughly forcing Marcus against the patrol car and cuffing him. The audio was crystal clear. Marcus's deliberate, articulate statement of an unlawful arrest, Decker's dismissive retort, the final, heavy slam of the car door. The video didn't just go online, it detonated. The first wave of retweets came from local students and Bay Area activists. Within 30 minutes, It was picked up by a handful of tech journalists who recognized the location and the sheer absurdity of the situation. They saw the irony immediately, a symbol of the tech industry's future being brought down by the analog prejudices of its present. The hashtags evolved. Hashtag Atherton Tesla arrest. Hashtag Justice for Marcus. By the time Lieutenant Sutton was walking into the booking area, the video had crossed a critical threshold. It was no longer a local story. It had been picked up by national news outlets. Cable news producers were scrambling, dispatching satellite trucks to the Northwood precinct. The story was perfect for the 24-hour news cycle. It had clear visuals, a compelling victim, an obvious villain, and it tapped directly into the rawest nerves of American society: race, class, and policing. In the sterile environment of the precinct, the digital firestorm felt like a distant rumor, but its heat was beginning to be felt. Sutton's tablet was a window into that inferno. She saw the view count ticking past 1 million. She saw screenshots of Marcus's face next to his official corporate bio from the Nexus Data website, which someone had already found and posted. CEO Marcus Thorne, Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year, arrested for stealing his own car. The narrative was set, and it was catastrophic for the department. Marcus was sitting in a small, quiet interview room with a bottle of water, the cuffs now a memory, when Lieutenant Sutton came in and closed the door. She looked exhausted. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her tone formal but laced with an undeniable stress. "First, on behalf of the Northwood Police Department, I want to offer my sincerest apology. What happened today was unacceptable. It was a failure of protocol and a failure of judgment." "The failure, Lieutenant," Marcus corrected her, his voice even, "was that your officer saw a black man in an expensive car and his brain defaulted to criminal. Everything else that happened was just a symptom of that initial failure." Sutton didn't flinch. She nodded. "You're not wrong. Officer Decker is being placed on administrative leave pending a full internal affairs investigation. The charges against you have been dropped. In fact, they were never formally filed." "That's reassuring," Marcus said, the sarcasm light but sharp. "My reputation, however, has been filed, processed, and distributed across the globe in the last 90 minutes. My face is currently trending on Twitter for being arrested." "We are aware," she said grimly. "We will be issuing a formal statement. We will make it clear that you were wrongfully detained and that you are an innocent party who was treated unprofessionally." Marcus leaned back in his chair. He took a slow sip of water. He had gone from a prisoner to a PR crisis the city needed to manage. The speed of the reversal was dizzying. An hour ago, his word meant nothing. Now, his story was the only thing that mattered. The power dynamic had shifted, not because of an internal process of justice, but because of the external pressure of 1 million strangers watching a video on their phones. The court of public opinion had convened, deliberated, and delivered its verdict with breathtaking speed. Officer Decker was guilty, the Northwood PD was guilty, and Marcus Thorne was the victim, a symbol of a systemic injustice that everyone knew existed but rarely saw so clearly documented. "A statement isn't enough, Lieutenant," Marcus said, his analytical mind already 5 steps ahead. He wasn't thinking about lawsuits or settlements, not yet. He was thinking about the system itself, the flawed algorithm that led to his arrest. What happened today wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about a system that allowed him to operate, a system that validated his assumptions with 2 backup cars and a set of handcuffs. Sutton listened, her expression unreadable. She knew he was right. The digital wildfire raging outside wasn't just about punishing one cop. It was a demand for accountability, for real, structural change. The verdict from the viral video wasn't just guilty, it was a mandate, and the entire city, from the police precinct to the mayor's office, was now under pressure to respond. The world was watching. and a simple apology was not going to be nearly enough. Mayor Robert Davies was in a meeting about municipal bond ratings when his chief of staff, a perpetually stressed woman named Clara, burst into the conference room without knocking. She held her phone out to him, her face ashen. "You need to see this. Now." Davies, a 55-year-old career politician with carefully coiffed gray hair and a practiced, reassuring smile, excused himself from the meeting. In the hallway, Clara played the video. Davies watched it once, then a second time, his smile melting away to be replaced by a tight, grim line. He didn't need to be told how bad this was. He could see it. The pristine, wealthy setting, the calm, well-dressed black man, the aggressive, unprofessional officer. The whole thing was a political time bomb, and the timer was already at 0. "Get me Chief Henderson," he snapped, already walking toward his office. "He's not available. He's on a fishing trip in Montana, unreachable until tomorrow." Clara stammered. "Of course he is," Davies muttered, the frustration boiling in his veins. A crisis was exploding, and his police chief was chasing trout. "Then get me the acting chief. Sutton. Get her on the line." By the time he reached his desk, the phones were ringing incessantly. Calls from the city council, from concerned donors, from the national media. The story was no longer just trending, it was the lead story on CNN's website. The headline read, "Tech mogul arrested in affluent suburb. Video ignites national outrage." Lieutenant Sutton's voice on the speakerphone was tense but professional. She quickly briefed him on the situation. Marcus Thorne, CEO of Nexus Data, Officer Ryan Decker, 5-year veteran with a history of complaints. The charges had been dropped. Mr. Thorne had been released without being processed. An internal investigation was being launched. "An internal investigation isn't going to cut it. Lieutenant," Davies barked, pacing his office. "The world thinks my city is a racist backwater. I've got Al Sharpton's producer on hold on line 2. I need action. I need something visible. What is Decker's status?" "On administrative leave, sir. Effective immediately." "Good. A start," Davies conceded. "Where is Mr. Thorne now?" "He's just left the precinct. We offered him a ride home in an unmarked car. He declined. He had a car service pick him up." Davies stopped pacing. Of course he declined. Why would he accept anything from them? The man had been publicly humiliated. Now he held all the cards. His next move would dictate the city's future. A lawsuit seemed inevitable. A press conference where he excoriated the city was likely. The potential damage was immense. "Clara, get me everything you can on Marcus Thorne," Davies ordered his chief of staff. "I want his corporate profile, his public statements, his philanthropic history, his political affiliations. I need to know who we're dealing with." For the next hour, Mayor Davies's office became a crisis command center. He wasn't focused on the justice of the situation. He was focused on the optics, on the political calculus of survival. This incident could define his mayorship. It could destroy his legacy and any hope he had for higher office. He had to get ahead of it. A simple press release and an apology wouldn't be enough. The public was baying for blood. They wanted more than a scapegoat. They wanted change. He needed a gesture, something bold, something that would demonstrate that he understood the gravity of the situation. Clara came back with a dossier on Marcus Thorne. The picture it painted was of a man who was not just successful, but deeply principled. He'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Oakland. He'd put himself through Stanford. He'd built his company from the ground up. He sat on the board of 2 charities focused on providing STEM education to underprivileged youth. He had no history of litigation, no public scandals. He was, in a political sense, the perfect victim. A man of unimpeachable character who had been wronged by a flawed system. "He's not an activist," Clara noted, reading from her notes. "He's never made any major political statements. He seems to be a guy who just keeps his head down and works. A builder. Davies stared out the window at the City Hall Plaza. A small crowd of protesters was already beginning to gather. A few news vans were setting up their cameras. The fire was spreading and he was running out of water. He needed to do something that no one would expect. A defensive crouch would be seen as weakness. A standard apology would be seen as insincere. He needed to change the narrative. An idea began to form in his mind, audacious and risky. What if he didn't treat Marcus Thorne as an adversary? What if he brought him inside? The old political maxim echoed in his head. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Thorne wasn't an enemy, but he was the most powerful voice in this crisis. What if Davies gave him a megaphone, but pointed it in a direction he could control? "Clara," Davies said, a new energy in his voice. "Cancel my afternoon. Draft a letter, a formal apology. Of course. But I want you to add something else. I want you to offer Mr. Thorne a seat on the Civilian Police Oversight Board, effective immediately." Clara's eyes widened. "Sir, is that wise? Bringing him inside the system that just chewed him up?" "It's not about what's wise, Clara. It's about what's necessary," Davies said, his gaze fixed on the growing crowd outside. "He's a builder. You said a problem solver. Fine. Let's give him a problem to solve. Let's give him a seat at the table. It's a hell of a lot better than having him build a battering ram to knock down the door." It was a calculated risk, a high-stakes political gambit. But it was the only move Davies could see that had the potential to transform a disaster into an opportunity. He would offer his biggest critic a role in his own reformation. It was a strategy born of desperation, but in the world of crisis management, desperation was often the mother of genius. Marcus returned not to his sprawling home in Los Altos Hills, but to the sleek, minimalist downtown office of Nexus Data. His house felt too quiet, too isolated. He needed to be in his element, surrounded by the familiar hum of servers and the quiet intensity of his team. He'd already spoken to his general counsel, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Elena, who was advising him to stay silent and let her handle the incoming media requests. He sat in his glass-walled office, looking out over the city, the adrenaline from the morning finally beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. His phone, which he'd silenced, was a constant black mirror of notifications, texts from friends, family, and colleagues he hadn't spoken to in years. All had seen the video. All were expressing a mixture of outrage and concern. He wasn't a public person. His success was known in his industry, but he had never sought the spotlight. Now, his face was the avatar for a national debate. He felt exposed, his privacy violated in a way that was far more profound than just a wrongful arrest. His identity had been hijacked. Around 3 p.m., his executive assistant buzzed him. "Mr. Thorne, there's a courier here with an urgent hand-delivered letter from the office of Mayor Robert Davies." "Bring it in, Sarah," he said. His curiosity piqued. The envelope was thick, embossed with the official city seal. The letter inside was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock. It began, as he expected, with a profuse and deeply formal apology. Davies called the incident a stain upon our city, a betrayal of the public trust, and a failure at every level. It was well-written political prose, designed to soothe and reassure. Marcus read it with a detached cynicism, but then came the second paragraph, the part that wasn't boilerplate. Words of apology are insufficient in the face of such a profound injustice. The letter continued. "Action is required. Your voice, Mr. Thorne, has become, in the course of a few short hours, a vital one in the conversation about the future of policing in our community. To that end, I would like to formally invite you to accept a position on the city's Civilian Police Oversight Board, effective immediately. This board has the power to review internal affairs investigations, recommend policy changes, and hold the department accountable. We need your perspective. We need your analytical rigor. We need your voice, not outside the system shouting in, but inside the system, helping to rebuild it. Marcus put the letter down on his desk. He stared at it for a long moment. It was a brilliant move, a masterstroke of political jujitsu. The mayor was trying to co-opt him, to neutralize him by bringing him into the fold. A seat on a civilian oversight board, it sounded important, but Marcus knew these boards were often toothless, designed more for public relations than for genuine reform. They were typically mired in bureaucracy, starved of resources, and ultimately advisory, with no real power to enforce their recommendations. His first instinct was to refuse, to issue a statement through his lawyer, thank the mayor for the offer, and then sue the city for $10 million. That was the clean, simple path. It was the path of righteous anger. But Marcus wasn't a simple man. He was a systems analyst. He looked at the world as a series of interconnected systems, and when a system was broken, his instinct was not to just punish it, but to understand it, to deconstruct it, and to fix it. The mayor, in his cynical political calculation, had inadvertently appealed to the very core of who Marcus was. He had called him a builder. He picked up the letter again. Inside the system, helping to rebuild it. Was it a trap? Almost certainly. Was it a genuine offer of power? Almost certainly not. But was it an opportunity? A door, slightly ajar, into the black box of the Northwood Police Department? Yes. It was that Elena, his lawyer, would advise against it. She would say it created a conflict of interest for his inevitable lawsuit. She would say it was a token gesture designed to silence him, and she would be right on all counts. But the image of Officer Decker's sneering face flashed in his mind. The cold bite of the handcuffs, the profound helplessness. He thought about the systemic failure, the flawed algorithm that ran on prejudice. A lawsuit would compensate him for his humiliation, but it wouldn't fix the underlying code. It would treat the symptom, not the disease. What if he could get his hands on the source code? What if he could see the data, the reports, the complaint files? What if he could apply his analytical mind to this broken system, just as he would to a failing supply chain? The thought was seductive. He looked out his window again. The world saw him as a victim. The mayor saw him as a political problem to be managed. But Marcus Thorne saw himself as an engineer, and he had just been handed a schematic, flawed and incomplete as it might be, to the very machine that had tried to crush him. He buzzed his assistant. "Sarah, get Mayor Davies on the phone for me." His lawyer would be furious. His friends would be confused. But Marcus Thorne had just made a decision. He was going to accept the invitation. He was going to step to the other side of the table, not as a pawn in the mayor's game, but as a systems analyst on his most important job yet. The first meeting of the Civilian Police Oversight Board was held a week later in a drab, windowless conference room in the basement of City Hall. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and bureaucracy. Marcus, dressed in his usual sharp suit, felt like an alien who had landed in a world of polyester and procedural motions. The other board members were a collection of well-meaning but largely worn-down civic figures. There was a retired high school principal, a local pastor, a real estate agent who had served on the board for a decade, and two lawyers who specialized in municipal law. They greeted him with a mixture of awe and caution. He was, by far, the most high-profile member in the board's history, and his presence had brought a bank of news cameras to the hallway outside. The meeting began, and Marcus quickly understood the nature of the machine he had stepped into. The agenda was a suffocating list of procedural votes, approving the minutes from the last meeting, a subcommittee report on departmental email retention policies, a 30-minute debate on the font size for the board's annual public report. It was a labyrinth of trivialities, designed to create the illusion of oversight while avoiding any real confrontation with power. When they finally got to the case reviews section of the agenda, Marcus leaned forward. The first case presented by the board's liaison from the police department was a review of an internal affairs investigation into an officer accused of rudeness during a traffic stop. The IA report was a masterpiece of obfuscation. It concluded that the officer's actions were within departmental guidelines and recommended supplemental verbal de-escalation training. "With all due respect," Marcus interjected, his voice cutting through the droning presentation. "What does that actually mean? What were the specific complaints? What did the body camera footage show? And what does supplemental verbal de-escalation training consist of? A 5-minute video?" The room went silent. The police liaison, a sergeant with a weary expression, blinked slowly. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. These kinds of pointed, specific questions were not part of the usual script. "The full investigation file is confidential personnel information. Mr. Thorne," the sergeant explained, his tone patient, as if speaking to a child, "the board receives the summary and the official findings. So, our role as an oversight board is to rubber stamp the conclusions of an investigation we're not allowed to actually see?" Marcus asked, incredulous. The retired principal, a woman named Carol, cleared her throat. "Marcus, we found that a cooperative relationship with the department yields the best results. We make recommendations. Sometimes they listen. Sometimes," Marcus pressed. "What is the board's success rate on having its recommendations implemented? Do we track that data?" More silence. It was clear no one had ever asked that question. The board operated on anecdotal evidence and a general sense of civic duty. It had no metrics, no KPIs, no way of measuring its own effectiveness. From a business perspective, it was a failing enterprise. The resistance wasn't aggressive. It was a soft, suffocating blanket of procedure and protocol. When Marcus asked for access to aggregate data on traffic stops, broken down by officer, time of day, and the race of the driver, he was told it would require a formal request that would have to be reviewed by the city's legal department. When he asked to see the complaint history for Officer Ryan Decker, he was informed that since Decker was the subject of an active internal affairs investigation, his file was completely sealed, even from the oversight board. It was a perfectly designed system of institutional inertia. Every request for meaningful information was met with a polite, reasonable-sounding roadblock. He was inside the building, but they had him trapped in the lobby. After the meeting, the local pastor, Reverend Michael Gaines, a man who had been a civil rights activist in his youth, pulled Marcus aside in the hallway. "I see the fire in you, son," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble. "And I'm glad you're here. But this board is designed to absorb that fire, not to spread it. They'll drown you in paperwork. They'll delay and defer until you get tired and quit." "I don't get tired, Reverend," Marcus replied, his jaw set. "I get data. Then you need to find a different way to get it," the Reverend advised. "The front door is guarded. You're a smart man. Look for a side entrance." Marcus left City Hall that evening feeling a frustration he hadn't felt since the early days of his startup, when every investor told him his ideas were impossible. He had been given a seat at the table, but the table was bolted to the floor in a locked room. Mayor Davies had played his hand perfectly. Marcus was on the inside, but he was powerless. But the Reverend's words stuck with him. look for a side entrance. Marcus was a tech guy. He understood that every system has a vulnerability. Every firewall has a port that someone forgot to close. The police department was a system like any other. It ran on information. And if they wouldn't give him the information he needed through official channels, he would have to find another way to access it. He wasn't a hacker, but he was an expert at finding patterns in chaos. He just needed the raw data, and he had a feeling the city was collecting far more of it than they even realized. The labyrinth was designed to defeat him, but Marcus Thorne was about to start redrawing the map. Marcus Thorne didn't sleep for the next 3 days. He went back to the mode that had built his company, relentless, caffeine-fueled immersion in a complex problem. The problem wasn't the police department's policies. It was his lack of access to the data that would prove those policies were failing. The official channels were a dead end. So, he followed the Reverend's advice and looked for a side door. And he found it in the most mundane of places, the city's public records portal. The city, like most municipalities, was required by law to make certain data sets public, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city's website. Marcus found a database of all dispatch calls for the last 5 years. It was messy, unstructured data, intended for academic researchers, not for oversight. But to Marcus, it was a gold mine. He also found traffic citation data, asset forfeiture records, and municipal court filings. It was a mountain of raw, disconnected information that most people would find impenetrable. For Marcus and his team at Nexus Data, it was a playground. He assembled a small, trusted team of his best data scientists, the same people who could predict a shipment delay in Singapore from a weather pattern in the Indian Ocean. He gave them a new task: build a comprehensive, multi-layered profile of the Northwood Police Department using only publicly available data. "Forget the official reports," he told them in a late-night meeting, the whiteboard behind him already covered in complex diagrams. "I want to know what the department does, not what it says it does. Correlate dispatch calls to arrests. Map traffic stops against census-tracked demographic data. Look for outliers. Look for patterns. Specifically, I want every data point you can find that involves Officer Ryan Decker." For the next 2 weeks, his team worked in secret. They ingested the data, cleaned it, and built a powerful analytics dashboard. The picture that began to emerge was stark, and it was far more damning than any single video could be. They could see, for example, that traffic stops in the city's 2 predominantly black neighborhoods were 300% more likely to result in a search of the vehicle than stops in affluent, white neighborhoods like Atherton. Even though the rate of finding contraband in those searches was significantly lower, they could see that noise complaints in white neighborhoods were typically logged as resolved with a warning, while the same complaint in a minority neighborhood was far more likely to result in a citation or an arrest for disorderly conduct. It was the cold, hard, statistical proof of a biased system. It was the algorithm of prejudice, written in the language of data. And then there was Officer Decker. Because Decker's name appeared on traffic citations and court filings, they could start to build a profile. His data was an anomaly within the anomaly. While the department as a whole showed bias, Decker's record was an extreme outlier. He issued citations for minor infractions, like improper display of a license plate, at a rate 5 times the departmental average, but almost exclusively in minority neighborhoods. Over 80% of the vehicle searches he initiated were of cars driven by black or Hispanic men. His hit rate for finding anything illegal in those searches was less than 2%. It was a clear, statistically undeniable pattern of harassment. The final piece of the puzzle came from the municipal court database. They found 5 separate cases in the last 2 years where charges brought by Officer Decker had been dismissed by a judge, with a notation from the district attorney's office: lacks sufficient evidence for prosecution. These were failed arrests, ghosts in the machine that never would have shown up in an official performance review, but were publicly documented in the court system. Marcus now had what the oversight board lacked: irrefutable evidence. He wasn't just the victim of a rogue cop anymore. He had the data that proved the cop was a predictable product of a broken and biased system. He had weaponized the city's own data against itself. He scheduled a meeting, not with the oversight board, but directly with Mayor Davies. He sent the mayor's office a single-page executive summary of his findings an hour before the meeting, a teaser designed to get the mayor's undivided attention. When Marcus walked into the mayor's office, the atmosphere was different. The forced political warmth was gone, replaced by a tense, wary respect. Davies was sitting at his large mahogany desk, the summary in his hand. He looked like a man who knew he was cornered. "Mr. Thorne," Davies began, forgoing the pleasantries. This is explosive. It's just data. Mr. Mayor," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even. He laid a thicker, bound report on the desk. "It's a diagnostic report on a system that is failing. My incident was not an anomaly. It was a predictable outcome. Your department is hemorrhaging community trust and exposing the city to massive legal and financial liability. My analysis proves it." He didn't make threats. He didn't raise his voice. He simply presented the facts, the same way he would to a corporate board. He had taken his personal story, his humiliation, and transformed it into an unassailable case for systemic reform, backed by millions of data points. Mayor Davies slowly paged through the report, his face growing paler with each page. He saw charts, graphs, and heat maps that told a story of two cities, one protected by the police and another targeted by them. He saw a clear, documented history of one of his officers engaging in biased policing, a history his own department had either missed or willfully ignored. Marcus had done what the Oversight Board, the Internal Affairs Department, and the City Council had failed to do for years. He had held up a mirror to the city, a mirror built not of opinion or anecdote, but of cold, hard numbers. The power dynamic had shifted again. Marcus Thorne was no longer just a board member. He was the most informed man in the room, and he had just handed the mayor a crisis far bigger than a single viral video. While Mayor Davies was grappling with the political fallout of Marcus's data bomb, a completely unrelated storm was breaking over the Northwood Police Department for months. A quiet investigation by the state's attorney general had been looking into allegations of bid rigging for contracts to supply the department with new vehicles and equipment. At the center of the investigation was Police Chief Frank Henderson. 2 days after Marcus's meeting with the mayor, the story broke. The Attorney General's office announced the indictment of Chief Henderson and 2 of his top deputies. The charges were damning: racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The investigation revealed a systematic scheme where Henderson had steered lucrative contracts to a company owned by his brother-in-law in exchange for kickbacks. He wasn't just a disconnected leader on a fishing trip. He was a corrupt one. The news hit City Hall like a seismic shockwave. The scandal involving Marcus Thorne was a crisis of legitimacy and public trust. This was a crisis of outright criminality at the highest level of the police department. Chief Henderson, who had flown back from his trip to a phalanx of reporters at the airport, announced his immediate resignation in a terse, angry press conference where he blamed political enemies and a witch hunt. The department was plunged into chaos. The top 2 deputies who would have been in line to take over were also named in the indictment and immediately suspended. The command structure had been decapitated. What was left was a leadership vacuum, a gaping hole at the very top of an organization that was already reeling from 2 simultaneous, devastating public crises. Rank-and-file officers were demoralized and confused. They felt besieged from the outside by public criticism and betrayed from the inside by their own leadership. Morale, which was already fragile after the Thorne incident, hit rock bottom. The department, an institution that ran on hierarchy and a clear chain of command, was suddenly adrift. For Mayor Davies, the situation had gone from a 5-alarm fire to a full-blown municipal catastrophe. His police chief was a criminal. His department was the subject of a national scandal for racist policing. The city was a laughingstock, a case study in failed governance. His political career was hanging by a thread. He called an emergency meeting with the city council. The atmosphere was panicked. Council members were fielding furious calls from constituents. The police union was demanding a meeting, worried that the department's instability would put their officers at risk. The city was on the brink of losing control of its own police force. "We need a leader," one councilwoman said, her voice shaking with anger. "We need someone to take charge, to clean house, and to restore some semblance of order and integrity to that department. And we need it yesterday." But who could it be? Promoting from within was impossible. The remaining command staff were either too junior or tainted by their association with the Henderson administration. Bringing in an outsider, a chief from another city, would take months, a national search, interviews, vetting. They didn't have months. They barely had hours. Davies sat at the head of the table, the weight of the city on his shoulders. He was trapped. The public's trust in the police was completely gone. They wouldn't accept a traditional replacement. They would see it as just another cog in the same broken machine. They needed something radical. They needed a symbol, someone who represented a complete and total break from the past. His mind kept going back to the man who had been in his office just 2 days before. A man who had demonstrated more insight into the department's failings in 2 weeks than anyone in Henderson's command staff had in years. A man who was calm under pressure, who was a proven leader, and who had the unassailable moral authority of having been wronged by the very system he now understood better than anyone. The idea was insane. It was ludicrous. It flew in the face of a century of tradition. He would be laughed out of the room. The police union would go on strike. The old guard of the city would call for his recall. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only possible move. It was a Hail Mary pass in the final seconds of a game they were losing badly. The city didn't just need a new police chief. It needed a revolution. And revolutions required revolutionary leaders. He thought of Marcus Thorne, the data-driven CEO, the systems analyst, the man who had been unjustly cuffed in a gas station. The leadership vacuum in the police department was more than just a problem. It was an opportunity for a reset so profound, so shocking, that it would force everyone to reconsider what a police department could and should be. The mayor took a deep breath. He knew that what he was about to propose would be the biggest political gamble of his life. He looked around the panicked faces of the city council members. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but firm, capturing the attention of the entire room. "I have a candidate in mind to serve as interim chief of police. It's an unconventional choice, but these are unconventional times." The phone call came at 7 a.m. Marcus was on his treadmill. The city skyline spread out before him through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his home gym. He was processing the news about Chief Henderson's indictment, analyzing its implications, when his phone rang with the mayor's private number. "Mr. Thorne, Robert Davies, I apologize for the early call." The mayor's voice was strained, stripped of its usual political smoothness. "Mr. Mayor, I imagine you have a busy day ahead," Marcus said, stepping off the treadmill and grabbing a towel. "That would be the understatement of the century," Davies replied with a dry, humorless chuckle. "Listen, I'm not going to waste your time. My city is in crisis. My police department is leaderless, disgraced, and hemorrhaging public trust. I need someone to take the helm, someone who can begin the process of rebuilding, not just the department, but the very idea of what policing means in this city. Marcus waited, sensing where this was going, but finding it hard to believe. The council and I met late into the night, Davies continued, his voice tight with the gravity of his own words. We need an interim chief of police, someone to take charge immediately, to stabilize the department, and to begin implementing the kind of deep, structural reforms that your own report proves are so desperately needed. The consensus is, the only person who has the credibility, the vision, and the moral authority to do this job right now is you. Silence. The only sound was Marcus's own breathing. He thought it might be a joke, a prank call, but the desperation in the mayor's voice was real. You want me? Marcus said slowly, letting the words hang in the air. The man your department arrested for stealing his own car 2 weeks ago, to be your next chief of police? I know how it sounds, Davies said, rushing to fill the silence. It's unprecedented. It's radical. But that's precisely why it might work. You're an outsider. You have no loyalty to the old guard or the broken culture. You have the analytical skills to diagnose the problems and the leadership experience to implement solutions. And most importantly, nobody in this city could question your motives. You have already paid the price for the department's failures. You are the one person they might actually trust to fix them. Marcus walked over to the window, looking down at the city below. It was a staggering proposition. He was a CEO, not a cop. He knew how to read a balance sheet, not a ballistics report. He knew how to manage engineers, not armed officers. He had a billion-dollar company to run, shareholders to answer to, a life he had meticulously built for himself. Mr. Mayor, I'm flattered, but I am completely unqualified, Marcus said, the practical, logical part of his brain taking over. I have no law enforcement experience. I've never fired a gun. I've never even been in a police station before 2 weeks ago, except on the wrong side of the booking desk. We'll surround you with experienced operational commanders who know the tactics and procedures, Davies countered, his voice insistent. This isn't about knowing how to conduct a raid. This is about knowing how to lead an organization. It's about strategy. It's about culture change. It's about accountability. That's a CEO's job, is it not? You would be the architect. They will be the builders. I need an architect, Marcus. The old building is burned to the ground. The mayor had used his first name. The plea was now personal. Marcus felt a strange, vertiginous feeling. The world had tilted on its axis. 2 weeks ago, he was a victim of a broken system. A week ago, he was a frustrated reformer, locked out of the halls of power. Now, he was being offered the keys to the entire kingdom. It was an audacious, almost insane gambit on the mayor's part, a desperate act of political survival. But it was also something more. It was a chance to do what he had only dreamed of, to take his data, his analysis, his vision of a more just system, and put it into practice. To go from being a protester to a president, in a sense. To go from writing the report to being the one to implement its recommendations. The risks were enormous. He would be walking into a department that would see him as the enemy. The police union would fight him at every turn. He could fail, spectacularly and publicly. It could destroy his reputation and everything he'd built. But what if he didn't? What if he could succeed? What if he could take this broken, corrupt, biased institution and rebuild it from the ground up, based on principles of data, transparency, and genuine public service? The scale of the challenge was terrifying. It was also irresistible. It was the ultimate systems engineering problem. I would need complete autonomy, Marcus heard himself say, the words surprising even him. I would report to you, but all operational and policy decisions within the department would be mine. I would need the city council's public, ironclad support, and I would need a commitment to fund the technological and training reforms my report outlined. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Marcus could hear the mayor let out a long, slow breath of relief. It was the sound of a man who had thrown a Hail Mary and saw his receiver inexplicably open in the end zone. "You'll have it," Davies said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever you need, just say yes." Marcus looked at his reflection in the glass. The man in the suit, the tech CEO, the victim, the reformer. He was about to add a new, improbable title to that list. "All right, Mr. Mayor," Marcus said, his voice steady, resolute. "I'll do it. I accept the position." The press conference announcing Marcus Thorne as the interim chief of police was a media circus. It was held on the steps of City Hall, with Mayor Davies looking both relieved and terrified, like a man who had just lit the fuse on a stick of dynamite, hoping it would clear a path rather than blow up in his face. Marcus stood beside him, calm and composed in a dark, conservative suit. Looking less like a police chief and more like the CEO he was, the reaction was immediate and polarized. Reform activists hailed it as a revolutionary step forward. The national media called it a bold, unprecedented experiment in American policing. And the Northwood Police Union released a scathing statement calling it a dangerous political stunt that puts the safety of our officers and our citizens at risk. His first day was the true test. He didn't arrive at the precinct in a chauffeured car, but in his own Tesla, which had been released from the impound lot a week earlier. He parked it in the chief's designated spot, a small act of defiance that did not go unnoticed. As he walked into the building, the same building he had been dragged into in handcuffs, the silence was palpable. Every officer in the bullpen stopped what they were doing and watched him. Their faces were a mixture of disbelief, resentment, and raw hostility. He was the enemy, the outsider, the man whose complaint had led to one of their own being suspended. And now he was their boss. His first act was to call a mandatory all-hands meeting in the precinct's roll call room. The room was packed, standing room only. He stood at the front, without a podium, without notes. He wore the same suit, but on his belt was a newly issued badge. He didn't wear a firearm. He looked out at the sea of blue uniforms and stony faces. He could feel their collective animosity washing over him. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and clear, amplified by the room's acoustics. "My name is Marcus Thorne, and as of 0800 hours this morning, I am your interim chief of police. I know that most of you, probably all of you, think I have no business being here. You're right. By any traditional measure, I am not qualified for this job. I am not one of you. I have not walked a beat, or answered a domestic violence call, or faced the split-second life-or-death decisions that you face." He let that admission hang in the air, allowing their skepticism to be validated. "But the city is in crisis," he continued. "This department is in crisis. Your former chief and his command staff are facing federal indictment for corruption, and our relationship with the community we are sworn to protect is completely broken. The old way of doing things has failed. It has failed the citizens of this city, and it has failed the good officers in this room, because the actions of a few have tarnished the badge for everyone." He started to walk slowly along the front line of officers, making eye contact. "I am not here to be your friend. I am here to be your leader. I am not a police officer. I am a systems analyst. And this is a system that is broken. My job is to fix it. I am going to be looking at the data. I am going to be looking at the policies. And I am going to be holding every single person in this department, starting with myself, accountable for their actions." He stopped in the center of the room. "I know about the blue wall. I know about the culture of silence. But I also know that most of you joined this force to protect and serve, to be a force for good. That is the department I want to lead, a department that is transparent, that is accountable, and that has the trust of its community. A department where good officers are supported and celebrated, and where officers who betray their oath are removed. He knew he needed allies, and he needed them quickly. He had spent the weekend reviewing the personnel files of the entire command staff. He'd found one name that stood out, Lieutenant Sutton. She was a 20-year veteran, respected by the rank and file, but known for being an independent thinker who had clashed with the old chief's cronies. Her record was impeccable. "My first act as chief," Marcus announced to the room, "is to promote Lieutenant Grace Sutton to the rank of deputy chief. She will be my second in command, and she will oversee all departmental operations. She knows this department, and she has my complete trust." A murmur went through the crowd. Sutton, who was standing in the back, looked stunned, but a flicker of determination hardened her features. It was a smart move. It showed he was willing to empower a respected insider, that he wasn't just there to burn the whole place down. "This is going to be difficult," Marcus concluded, his voice resonating with a quiet power. "There will be changes. Some of them you will not like. But I am asking you to give me a chance. A chance to prove that we can build a better department. A chance to earn back the trust of the city we serve. That is all. Dismissed." The officers filed out in silence, their expressions still guarded, still skeptical. But something had shifted. He had faced them directly. He had not flinched. He had spoken with a clarity and purpose that had been absent from the department's leadership for years. He had walked into the lion's den, and while he hadn't tamed the lions, he had at least shown them he was not afraid. The long, brutal, and necessary work of changing the system had begun. In his new office, the one that had belonged to the disgraced Chief Henderson, Marcus Thorne began the process of deconstruction. The office itself was a relic of the old guard, dark wood paneling, leather-bound law books that looked like they'd never been opened, and a large, ornate desk that felt more like a throne than a workspace. Marcus had most of it cleared out, replaced with whiteboards, large monitors displaying real-time data dashboards, and a simple, functional desk. He spent his first week with his new deputy chief, Grace Sutton, in a series of marathon meetings. She was his guide to the department's complex inner workings, its tribal politics, and its unwritten rules. She was cautious at first, but she quickly realized that Marcus was not a politician. He was a problem solver. He listened, he asked incisive questions, and he absorbed information at an astonishing rate. A fragile, professional trust began to form between the tech CEO and the career cop. On Friday of his first week, Marcus asked Sutton for a specific file. "I want to see the complete, unredacted internal affairs and personnel file for Officer Ryan Decker," he said. Sutton nodded, a grim understanding in her eyes. "I'll have it brought to your office." An hour later, a file box, thick with years of paperwork, landed on his desk with a heavy thud. For the next several hours, Marcus read. It was even worse than his data had predicted. The file was a portrait of a problem officer who had been protected by the system at every turn. 32 citizen complaints over 5 years, allegations of excessive force, verbal abuse, and biased policing. Each investigation had followed a predictable pattern, the complainant's story. Decker's official denial, a lack of independent witnesses, and a finding of unsubstantiated. He had been ordered to attend remedial training on 4 separate occasions, but there was no evidence the training had ever changed his behavior. The file was a monument to institutional failure. Everyone who had reviewed it before, sergeants, lieutenants, internal affairs investigators, even the former chief, had chosen to pass the problem along. to give the officer another chance, to avoid the difficult work of removing a bad cop from the street. Marcus closed the file. His own name and complaint were now the final entry in this long, sordid history. But this time, the outcome would be different. He picked up his desk phone. "Sarah, please ask Officer Ryan Decker to report to my office. Immediately." 20 minutes later, there was a sharp knock on his door. Officer Decker stood in the doorway. He was in his full uniform, but he looked smaller, less imposing, without the backdrop of the sun-drenched gas station. The mirrored sunglasses were gone. His eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and belligerent defiance. He had been on paid leave for weeks, in limbo, waiting to see how the political winds would shift. Now, he was face to face with the man he had arrested, and that man was sitting behind the chief's desk. The power dynamic had been completely and devastatingly inverted. "Officer Decker, come in." "Close the door," Marcus said, his voice neutral. Decker entered and stood stiffly in front of the desk, his hands clasped behind his back in a parade rest stance. Marcus gestured to the thick file box on the corner of his desk. "I've just spent my afternoon reading your service record. It's quite a document." Decker said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle pulsed in his cheek. 32 citizen complaints. "Officer," Marcus continued, his voice still calm, analytical. "A statistically significant pattern of targeting minority drivers, multiple instances of excessive force allegations, and my own personal experience, where you refused to listen to reason, refused to verify basic facts, and escalated a situation based on what I can only conclude were your own personal biases. You saw a black man in an expensive car, and you saw a crime. You didn't see a citizen. You didn't see a person. You saw a stereotype." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with Decker's. "The question I have, officer, is not if you should be a police officer. This file makes it abundantly clear that you should not. The question is why you are still a police officer. Why a system that is supposed to weed out officers like you has instead protected you, again and again." Decker finally broke his silence, his voice cracking with a frustrated rage. "I was doing my job. I was following procedure. I had a report of a stolen vehicle." "You had a report," Marcus countered, his voice like ice. "And you had the actual owner of the vehicle standing right in front of you, offering you proof. You chose to believe the report over the reality. You chose confrontation over verification. You chose your authority over the truth. That's not procedure. Officer, that's a character flaw. And it's a flaw that is incompatible with wearing this badge." The confrontation was no longer about Marcus's personal grievance. It was about the integrity of the entire department. Decker was a symptom of the disease that Marcus had been hired to cure. "The internal affairs investigation into my arrest of you is still ongoing," Decker said, grasping at the last straws of protocol. Marcus stood up and walked around the desk, standing just a few feet from the officer. They were now just two men in a room. "That investigation is over," Marcus said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his new position. "As of this moment, I have reviewed the evidence, including your own body camera footage and your history of conduct. Officer Ryan Decker, your employment with the Northwood Police Department is terminated. Effective immediately." Decker stared at him, his mouth slightly agape, the defiance in his eyes finally crumbling into sheer, unadulterated shock. The system that had always protected him, that had always looked the other way, had just been wielded against him with absolute finality. The man he had cuffed was now the man who had fired him. The circle was complete. Firing Officer Decker was a necessary act of amputation, but it didn't cure the disease. It sent a powerful message through the department that the old ways were over. But Marcus knew that real change wasn't about punishing one officer. It was about redesigning the system that produced him. He was an architect, and he was about to lay the foundation for a new kind of police department, one built on the principles he understood best: data, transparency, and accountability. His first major initiative, which he developed in marathon sessions with Deputy Chief Sutton and a team of policy experts, was a complete overhaul of the department's traffic stop protocols. He called it the Verification and De-escalation Initiative, or VDI. The core of VDI was simple but revolutionary for the department. It shifted the primary goal of a traffic stop from enforcement to confirmation. Officers were now mandated to use all available technological tools: running plates, checking digital IDs using their in-car computers, to verify a driver's status and vehicle ownership before escalating to a confrontational line of questioning. The protocol explicitly stated that a driver's calm attempt to provide digital proof of identity or ownership, like Marcus had done, was to be considered cooperation, not obstruction. But the most significant part of VDI was the data component. Every single traffic stop was now to be logged with a dozen new data points: the reason for the stop, the demographics of the driver, whether a search was conducted, the justification for the search, and the outcome. All of this data would feed directly into a real-time public-facing dashboard on the city's website. Citizens, journalists, and civil rights groups could now see, day by day, who the Northwood PD was stopping and why. The second, and more controversial, reform was the creation of a new early warning system within the department. Marcus and his team at Nexus Data designed the software, adapting the same predictive analytics they used for supply chains. The system would track officer performance data, use of force incidents, citizen complaints, missed court dates, even the number of traffic stops that resulted in dismissals. When an officer's data points crossed a certain threshold, flagging them as a high-risk outlier, as Decker surely would have been, it would automatically trigger a mandatory review and intervention protocol. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about identifying struggling officers and intervening with training, counseling, or reassignment before their behavior escalated into a crisis. The police union went ballistic. The union president, a pugnacious veteran named Frank O'Malley, demanded a meeting. He sat in Marcus's office, his face red with anger. "This is big brother stuff. Chief," O'Malley fumed, "you're treating my officers like they're cogs in a machine, not human beings. This dashboard is going to put a target on their backs, and this early warning system is a witch hunt waiting to happen." Marcus listened patiently, letting O'Malley vent. When he was finished, Marcus leaned forward. "Frank, your officers are human beings, and human beings have biases. They make mistakes. They have bad days. This system isn't designed to punish them. It's designed to support them by identifying problems early. It protects good officers from being tarnished by the actions of the few. And the public dashboard? That's not a target. That's accountability. It's how we rebuild trust. We have to be willing to show the public our work. If we are doing our jobs fairly and professionally, the data will prove it. If we are not, the data will show us where we need to fix things." He pulled up the prototype for the dashboard on his large monitor. "Look," he said, pointing to a chart. "This will also show commendations, positive community interactions, cases solved. This isn't just about catching bad cops. It's about highlighting the good work that gets lost in the noise." O'Malley was still skeptical, but Marcus's calm, data-driven approach was difficult to argue with. He wasn't attacking the officers. He was trying to fix the framework in which they operated. Implementation was a monumental task. It required new software, new hardware in every patrol car, and, most importantly, a massive retraining effort for every officer on the force. Deputy Chief Sutton took the lead on the training, translating Marcus's analytical vision into practical, on-the-street procedures that the cops could understand and respect. There was grumbling, there was resistance, but there was also a grudging sense among many of the younger officers that the changes were necessary, that the old way had led them to this crisis, and that this new, transparent approach might be the only way forward. Marcus was no longer just the interim chief. He was the chief architect of a new policing model. He was using the tools of his old life, data analysis, systems engineering, strategic planning, to reshape his new one. The reforms were radical, controversial, and untested, but for the first time in years, the Northwood Police Department wasn't just reacting to crises. It was actively trying to build a system to prevent them. 6 months flew by in a blur of policy meetings, community town halls, and late-night budget sessions. The changes Marcus implemented were not instantaneous magic bullets, but the initial data was promising. The public dashboard showed a marked decrease in searches during traffic stops in minority neighborhoods. Citizen complaints were down by 40%. The early warning system had flagged 3 officers for intervention, leading to 2 being reassigned to desk duty and 1 entering a counseling program. The department wasn't fixed, but it was healing. Marcus Thorne, the tech CEO, had proven to be a remarkably effective chief of police. He had earned the grudging respect of many officers, who saw that his data-driven approach was, at its core, fair. He had gained the cautious trust of the community, who saw a level of transparency and accountability they had never seen before. He and Deputy Chief Sutton had become a formidable team, his strategic vision paired with her operational expertise. His interim term was set to expire at the end of the month. Mayor Davies, whose political career had been resurrected by the success of his audacious gamble, called Marcus to his office. The atmosphere was a world away from the panicked, desperate meetings of their past. "Marcus," Davies began, a genuine smile on his face, "what you have accomplished in 6 months is nothing short of miraculous. You've stabilized the department, you've initiated landmark reforms, and you've begun the process of restoring public trust. You took an impossible situation and turned it into a model for the nation." He slid a document across the desk. It was a formal contract. "The City Council has voted unanimously. We would like to offer you the position of Chief of Police, a full 5-year term." Marcus looked at the contract. This was the moment he had been working toward, the validation of his radical approach. This was the offer to make the revolution permanent. 6 months ago, he would have thought this was the ultimate victory. But now, he wasn't so sure. He had been so consumed by the mission of fixing the department that he had barely thought about his old life. His company, Nexus Data, was being run by his very capable COO. But it wasn't the same. He missed the thrill of innovation, of building something new from scratch. He missed the world of technology, where logic and code reigned supreme. The world of policing, even a reformed one, was still a world of messy, unpredictable human behavior. It was draining in a way building a company had never been. He was 42 years old. Did he want to spend the next 5 years of his life navigating city politics, police union negotiations, and the endless, heartbreaking stream of human tragedy that was the daily business of law enforcement? Or did he want to return to his life, to his company, to the world he had built and that he loved? He thought about the crossroads he was at. One path led back to a life of comfort, wealth, and intellectual challenge on his own terms. The other path led forward into a life of public service, of immense responsibility, and of the constant, grinding work of systemic change. He had become a symbol. He knew that. He was the man who had turned his own injustice into a force for reform. If he walked away now, would the reforms stick? Or would the department, under a new, more traditional chief, slowly slide back into its old ways? He had started the revolution, but was he obligated to see it through? "Mayor," Marcus said slowly, "I am honored. Truly. But I need some time to think. This isn't the life I ever imagined for myself." Davies nodded, his expression understanding. "I know. Take the weekend. But know this, Marcus. What you started here is bigger than just Northwood. Police departments from all over the country are calling us, asking about your VDI program, about your analytics dashboard. You haven't just reformed a department. You've started a movement, whether you stay or not. That will be your legacy." Marcus left City Hall and drove, not home, but to the gas station in Atherton. He parked his Tesla at the same charging station. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, much like that day 6 months ago. He stood in the spot where he had been handcuffed, the phantom feeling of the cold steel still a faint memory on his wrists. He had won. He had gotten justice, not just for himself, but for countless others who might have been the next victim of a flawed system. He had architected the change he wanted to see in the world. The question now was simpler and infinitely more complex. Who did he want to be? The architect who designs the beautiful, revolutionary building and moves on to the next project? Or the custodian who stays behind to make sure the foundation is strong, the lights stay on, and the building serves its purpose for generations to come? He looked up at the blue sky, the hum of the charger a familiar, comforting sound. He had a choice to make, a choice between the life he had earned and the duty he had unexpectedly found. In the end, the choice wasn't about desire, but about responsibility. Marcus Thorne accepted the 5-year term. He stayed because he understood a fundamental truth of systems engineering. Implementation is only half the battle. The other half is maintenance, adaptation, and the relentless defense against the system's powerful inertia to revert to its old form. He stayed because the custodian's job was, in its own way, more important than the architect's. Looking back, it's easy to villainize Officer Decker, to see him as the sole cause of the crisis. But that's too simple. Decker was not a monster. He was a product. He was a young man who likely joined the force with a desire to impose order on a chaotic world. But he was molded by a culture that equated questioning with weakness and compliance with respect. He was armed with a badge that he saw as a shield for his instincts, not a lens for the truth. His core failure wasn't malice, but a profound lack of curiosity, a trained inability to entertain the possibility that his initial assumption, black man, expensive car, ergo criminal, could be wrong. The system had never demanded that curiosity from him. In fact, it had rewarded his aggressive certainty. Complaint after complaint, until the day he aimed it at the one man who had the power to dismantle the system itself. Could Marcus have done things differently that day? Perhaps. If he had immediately put his hands on the hood, if he had been more submissive, he might have avoided the arrest. But in doing so, he would have validated Decker's prejudice. He would have conceded that his identity was subordinate to the officer's suspicion. His quiet. Logical resistance wasn't an act of defiance for its own sake. It was an act of self-preservation, a refusal to have his reality erased. His greatest protection, it turned out, wasn't compliance. It was the unblinking eye of a bystander's camera and the unassailable logic of his own data. The lesson is not for the victim to be more compliant, but for the system to be more just. The story of Marcus Thorne became a parable in modern policing, a testament to the idea that true reform requires more than just new rules. It requires a new kind of leader, a new way of seeing. It's a story about how a single moment of injustice, when captured and amplified, can become a catalyst for profound change. It proves that data can be a more powerful weapon for accountability than any protest sign, and that sometimes the person best equipped to fix a broken system is the one who has felt its crushing weight most acutely. What do you think is the hardest part of changing a long-standing culture, whether it's in a police department or any other institution? At what point does a personal injustice become a public responsibility? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider supporting our channel.